Finance Committee meeting for May 4th, 2020. I'll start with a roll call. Adel Mosip.
Here.
Jim Thorpe.
Here.
Roxanne McDonald here. We also have Thomas Wall and Glenn Maleko, as well as David Mustonen. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and pass the floor on to Tom Wall, our finance director, and he'll get us going.
All right, I'm going to switch over to present now. That way you guys can follow along if you like. So it's converting, so give me 1 second. As you guys, I know I got a message. You're presenting to everyone, but it doesn't actually show anything yet. You guys see anything on your screen?
Just you're presenting to everyone.
All right.
There we go.
All right. So here's the agenda. We're just going to go down the list here. I have 60 minutes set aside for the meeting, but it can last shorter or longer depending. And just go ahead and just ask questions as we go along. There is, this is more of a give and take conversation versus a presentation. And we also have Elaine Starrett on the line. She's listening in. She won't be discussing much unless we actually call her. So the first one is, as you're aware, the state has now started to come out with a lot of documents about this current year funding and next year funding. So on the agenda, I'm going to go to the very first one for the April 27th. It's when I had a meeting with a webinar with the state. And I'm just going to highlight a few things on here. And the two people are the state budget office from the House, one from the Senate. And one of the things they just wanted to know is when we look at the state budget, and on here you can see a pie chart. I'm going to make it a little bigger so it's easier to see. So as you can see, this is the combined general fund and school aid fund. So as you can see, the school aid fund makes up 54% of the total budget for the state of Michigan. And you can see the other sections of higher ed, community colleges, health and human services, corrections, and state police, debt service, and all other, those are the departments. So when you talk about the state budget, anything you're going to do with school aid is making up more than half of the total budget. So whenever you see a shortfall in the general fund, knowing that they have a much smaller pie to work with, and when you see money in the school aid fund, and as the time has gone over these last 10, 12 years, they've been actually trying to shift money into the school aid fund. And we're not going to go too deep into that, but they just make sure you're aware of how big that is. And this is just looking at the general fund portion only. And you can see that health and human services make up almost half of the pot for just the general fund. So when you talk about what they can do to change things, if there's a budget shortfall, they're very limited that the school aid fund makes up half. And when they talk about their share, the health and human services make up half. And so just kind of give you a basis of where the money is at the state level. So this was as of last Monday, a week ago today. They were talking about the shortfall in the revenue of 1 to 3 billion in fiscal year 20 and 1 to 4 billion in fiscal year 21.
And fiscal year 20 has like 2 months left, correct?
For us, but remember the state budget year ends September 30th.
September, that's right.
5 months, yep.
And Tom, this is their overall, not their state, the school aid.
Right, this is just overall budget, yes. And they use the U of M research seminar as one of their components when they talk about the revenue consensus meeting that's coming up on May 15th. And their numbers are right in that range also. So it wasn't very promising news that we heard. So then they started talking about some of the other things that are out there in the budget that they have some flexibility with. And we won't get too far into that, but they do have some money where they can help alleviate some of these things. Now, they've just got some FEMA money, and the CARES Act came through. Unfortunately, the first couple of rounds from the federal side have been very restricted in how they can spend the money. So what they've been lobbying at the federal level is to have, if there's a fourth level of funding from the federal government. They want it to be a lot more flexible so they can kind of back into some of the revenue losses that they're realizing here in the second quarter of the calendar year. So that's just breaking down some of the money that's coming through. Part of the elementary and secondary school and emergency relief fund at 390 million. We are going to get roughly about 8.5 million from that fund. And that was allocated based on the Title I funding allocation through the state of Michigan. Now, we don't have to follow Title I guidelines. There's a list of like 14 or 15 criteria the money on. We're obviously going to continue to work on that. The state has just put that out last week. So we're going to have some conversations at the district level to see how we can do that 8.5 million. You'll see that in some of the projections later. And that's just another screen on it. And obviously the governor has some additional money out there to do some relief with, including the budgetary stabilization fund that's further on down. But just kind of give you an idea, there is some money out there that she can use to help balance this budget. So this is what they have done. They put obviously a hiring freeze, but you know, the state portion of that pie for their hiring is very small. So it's not going to make a big difference. Discretionary spending freeze and look at budget reductions. Now, May 15th will be the next big date where we actually get to see where the revenues are going to come in this quarter and for the next 2 subsequent years where their estimations change. One of the things that they hear, the very last bullet item, that since they postpone the actual income taxes until the end of July, that they're not going to have a good handle on the revenues until actually that filing deadline has passed. So one of the things I heard today was they're actually talking about having a subsequent revenue consensus meeting in August to kind of look at the revenues that came in for July for income tax and then maybe reset the budget parameters to work with. So everything I've heard to date is that everything's been being pushed down the road because they don't have good data, except that it's really bad when it looks at the revenue streams coming into the state of Michigan. And this is no different to any state that's, you know, in the US that's probably having the very similar conversations. All right. Then we had another budget update today. Unfortunately, they did not actually come through yet with the actual presentation, but some of the things we saw in there that they're looking at the end of calendar year 22 for the state economy to kind of get back to normal. So if you look at some of the graphs, which I'll share, they promised to post it within 24 hours, and that meeting ended around 3:30. So overnight, hopefully they'll get it out there, and I'll bring out, just post it onto this agenda also, and just put a link to it. But you'll see where they even went back to the recession we had in 2008 and showing you how that kind of dipped in the economy when you talk about jobs and money revenues. You'll see such a sharp decline, obviously, from the second quarter, and you'll see a sharp incline. But by fiscal year 22 is when you'll actually see that we're kind of getting back to where we are right now. So when we are looking at the revenue projections that you'll look at later, you'll see a big reduction for next year and a slow gradually bring it back up, that in a couple of years, our revenue stream would kind of be back to normal.
So do they anticipate that the fiscal year 22, things will be on a slight incline?
Yes. So
Okay, and then toward the end of the year, it should
the first 2
stabilize.
years are really bad, and then you'll see us kind of manage back up to normal. But the thing is, that revenue stream we would have received those 2 years is lost.
It's lost, yeah.
Yeah, so that, you know, that roughly that $3 million would have gotten over that time frame is lost. So that means we are going to have to readjust the budget. But when we get to that fiscal year 22, we'll be balanced, but we'll just have to figure out how to make up that lost revenue from the previous 2 years. That makes sense to you? But you'll see the graphic presentation later. All right, and this was all completed last week. And on Friday, there was a joint memo that came out from MESA, MSBO, MESB. That's the administrators group, the school business group, the board member group, and MDE that's those statewide organizations came out with a statement on that also. I'm just gonna enlarge it here.
I read that memo, but half of mine was cut off, so it was a little difficult
Yes,
to read.
so I relinked it today.
Okay.
So I saw that as, I don't know why it was half cut off, but I relinked it today so you get the full amount.
Okay, thank you.
And so if you look in the second paragraph towards the end, it said the general fund school aid fund could be below budget estimates by 1 to 3 billion this fiscal year and between 1 to 4 billion the next fiscal year. So a week later, they're basically still at the same spot where they were a week ago, to saying that the shortfall is still coming in at that level. So what they're recommending, which we have been doing for years, which is always kind of nice to see that they're actually validating what we've done, is set up several budget scenarios where you look at different cuts to the foundation allowance. And if you notice, nothing is flat, everything is a cut. So they set an example of 200, 350, 500, and 650 pupil reduction in the foundation allowance. And I'm glad, that my numbers came in very close to these numbers. So I feel like at least I was in the ballpark. And to obviously monitor the expenses, which we're doing now with COVID-19. If you remember, when we actually submitted our plan, we already captured roughly about 3.3 million in additional expenditures for 2019-20 school year. That was part of our plan submission to Wayne Risa. And so this is obviously going to be a bigger hit than what we've done back in 2008 for most districts. Not so much for Dearborn, because you remember Dearborn, not only did we get the 470 cut in our per pupil foundation allowance, we also lost some of our hold harmless money and our at-risk money at the same time.
Yeah.
In the district at that time, we had to make severe cuts at that time to kind of get it into balance. Now, fortunately, we have some other avenues today that we can work with, and we're going to potentially get some of the federal money. So that's some of the things we're going to have to discuss as we. And that was just basically the next section, just talking about the mid-May revenue consensus meeting that's going to come up, and that everyone's in the same boat. So everyone's trying to get a lot of information out there, but at this point, there's not been a lot of decisions made at the federal level or the state level on this budget shortfall outside of the CARES Act money that we have to deal with. All right, so now we're going to go to our normal budget review of our model. And on here, you'll see the best, most likely, and worst case scenarios. And after we go through this, we'll actually talk about some projections where I went out and looked out 3 to 5 years to see what our budget's going to look like going forward. All right, so our budget calendar. And what we'll do at this point, I think, is we're just going to go to the most likely scenario. So there's different tabs on the bottom. If you go to the most likely scenario, so our budget most likely scenario always starts out with the history of where we ended up in the last 7 years and our percentage of fund balance. So you can see on line 10, and I'll make it a little bigger. So on fiscal year 19, the year we just finished last year, we were at 30. Can you see my cursor move?
Yes.
Okay, just so you know where I'm talking to. You can see that we have 33 million and change in our fund balance at the end of last school year. And that was a 14.34% fund balance allocation.
I have a question, Tom.
Yes.
I was trying to recall if being below 5% of fund balance, there was a stipulation that you'd be penalized for that, or was that just the suggestion that you always be above 5%?
No,
I couldn't remember if there was a penalty.
If you got below 5%, it would trigger some mandatory reporting.
That's right.
Michigan. And if you did mandatory reporting, then they would have a going concern and they would potentially withhold state aid until you actually filed the paperwork. And when I first came here, we were at 5.62%. And that's where we made a decision at that point to start putting some money away into fund balance and raise that number up as one of the goals we had in the budgetary process.
If I can add too, Tom, before you got hired, because you got hired a few months after I did as superintendent, we also, from the 14-15 year, we were below that 5%.
Right.
The notice came in, I believe it was just below, it was like close, but, and then that would have triggered other things, I believe. And so that's why, then we started rebuild. Obviously, there were tough budget times. So the board at the time who was there and the district made decisions because, going back to 07, 08, when we took huge hits. Part of that was done purposely because, in 2009, you might remember the mid-year layoffs and other things. So
I remember working so hard to get that fund balance up, and I'm awfully glad we did.
Tom, question for you.
Yes.
When we see the large jump in the fund balance from 2016 to 2017, isn't that though because of the Wayne County enhancement millage and how we're always kind of banking that because it'll come due 3 more years from now, I think now?
Right. That was a 6-year millage, and we decided because we were actually borrowing money to get through the July and August months to get to our full funding. Because even though our school year ends on June 30th, we still get July and August, 2 additional months of state aid for the previous year. So we were always needing money to get there until the tax collections can come in starting in late July for that tax year. So we were always borrowing. And one of the things we said, we can get away from paying interest costs and have better cash flow where we could actually start investing money and making some money, interest earnings versus paying interest costs. So it's kind of a double, benefit to the program doing it that way. And that's why you see such a large increase that fiscal year.
But while that's helped us to this point, does it give us a false sense of security? Because that money from that millage wasn't really having a purpose to increase our fund balance. And that's what we've done one time and just kept it rolling.
Right. And what we try to do is when we look at the enhancement millage funds, we try to stay away from the ongoing costs and look at one-time projects. A good example from some of the larger projects we've done is we did the Dearborn High addition out of that funds of roughly $3.2 million. We did a brand new phone system as part of our emergency planning because we had to get to the E911 projects and be able to notify if a 911 call was anywhere in our buildings within 50 feet, they would know where that E911 call was made. And now we're looking at replacing all the TVs as a second phase of emergency planning because all the TVs and the emergency notifications on there are end of life and we can't get parts anymore. And that system is basically going defunct. And now we're going to have a new emergency notification panel in each classroom that could be used for different purposes. And so we're trying to say those kind of things, we're trying to do one-time costs that will at least, that if the money does not come in again, we have the flexibility to absorb what we're doing back into the program.
Well, Tom, can I add something too, based on our executive cabinet meeting with the budget, that also would mean, because we're doing that way, Trustee Thorpe, is that, if we forego some of the planning that we may have needed to purchase those big, one-time expenses, it could be another way to still have some of that money in an emergency situation. For example, curriculum materials or for example, the attendance incentive. Correct. That comes out of those areas. So there's ways to because Tom's been he's been a stickler in making sure it's one-time expenses. There's a few probably salaries, but I think most of the salaries have come off of that from what I.
Well, one of the 1.5 million we use out of that enhancement fund is for class size adjustments. So we always, the budgeting process, get back to our normal 21 to 23 for elementary, 23 to 25 for middle school, and 25 to 27 for high school. And every once in a while, that never comes out even because kids don't come in blocks. They're all over the place. So we use the enhancement funds to lower those hot spots in our classrooms to bring down those class sizes, say like in a 5th grade at one particular elementary. Knowing that next year we go back to the normal scheduling process, And so we don't use that money except for a 1-year span to kind of fill in those hotspots to get to good class sizes across the entire district. And so those kind of things, that's a decision-making process, but they know it's only a 1 year. And next year, when they do their class assignments at the beginning, when we're developing in the spring, they know they have to get back to that base model. And so we're not using up that fund for operational purposes year after year after year. So every year it gets reallocated for what we want to use that money for. Again, knowing that it's not going to be something that's going to continue for year after year and year in case this ever went away.
One other question about fund balance percentage. About what percentage do we need to be at to avoid borrowing in the summer?
Normally we looked anywhere from 10%.
I'm sorry, 10 to?
10 to 12%. But I can't say that I've actually looked at it for a while.
Well,
It's
that gives
probably-
me a base idea. That's what I was looking for.
Yep. All right, and we adopted the amended budget in February. You remember last year, we're in a very similar situation where we didn't know where our revenue is going to be back in May and June of last year. So we were concerned about some projections we were getting, and we did go through some smaller cuts at that time to look at getting our program back to a more even level. And then our revenues came in much higher, and our student count was actually right on, which is good. Abe always does a good job with that. So we had extra money this year. So normally we'd have been much higher in our surplus for this year. But if you remember, $2 million we set aside for the bond. Since the bond was successful, we put $2 million into the capital project fund for this year only, knowing that next year that $2 million will go away and we get back to our allocation that we had. So that's something that you'll see later on in this budget presentation too, that we're going to be using that to help fund this shortfall also. Now, on top of all that, I'm estimating on the most likely scenario to have enough for roughly another $1 million in surplus this fiscal year. And that's, if you look, we had a very mild winter again, which is very nice. You know, we had hardly any snowfall. Well, a very small snowfall this year, which means our buildings weren't as cold. So we were able to save some money on the heating side. And even though we're spending money on the COVID-19 here in the last month and a half, we still have not incurred some of the costs that we have for like transportation, overtime, all the field trip money that we normally would bring one of our busiest times of the year. So all those kind of costs are not incurring. So we are going to have a surplus that gets generated from this fiscal year. Now, one of the things we're worried about, if you remember back to the presentation from the state, they said 1 to 3 billion shortfall this fiscal year. The governor hasn't talked about any kind of rollback on our revenue for this fiscal year, but the Senate Majority Leader has talked about potentially rolling back some of our state aid in July. But we haven't obviously seen any kind of direction yet because they haven't even started those discussions. So this is assuming there is no rollback for this fiscal year as it stands right now.
If that were the case, would there be a deadline when they'd have to announce it?
Nope, the state's deadline is September 30th, so they could do it well after even we get our last August payment of state aid.
Okay, perfect.
Our state aid comes from October through August on the 20th or whatever, forward or backward, depending if it's a weekend, August 20th of each month.
Tom, for the money that was allocated last year, you said 2.3 million that went into capital projects because of
additional 2.5. So we had 3.5 million we set aside for capital projects this year.
So then that money will be reversed and goes back to the general fund to offset.
That'll be part of our budget discussions, but at least 2 million of that 3.5 was expected to come back into the general budget discussions of how to use.
Okay.
We'll see later that we'll get here shortly. You'll see that I actually took a little more than that, but we'll walk through it as we go along. So looking at this scenario, and again, this is a living document. So we have budget discussions weekly from here to the end of, to mid-June before we actually adopt a budget. So these numbers will change slightly as we have those conversations. On this one, on the date of 4/30, we're going to recommend that roughly we'll have about $1 million left over this year. It will go into our fund balance at the end of this year, projected at $34,700,000, and that'll be roughly 14.79%. But now we take that, because the model we base upon, this is our current program that we have operating the district as of right now. So what we do, we plan going forward, we say, all right, this is our baseline, this current program. So what's going to change between this program and next year? And that's what we're going to go through now, is the assumptions we have on that. All right, so when we're looking at this, obviously we budgeted a $67,000 surplus. We know that's going to continue if we have the same program this year. So looking at our student counts, so right now we are looking at a 104 student increase for next year. We already know, if you remember, student counts are based on a February and a October Monday or Tuesday attendance in the calendar year 2020. So obviously in February 2020, we already have that date in, and that February date is worth 10% of our student count, and the fall will be 90%. So obviously the fall has a greater impact, but we already know one of the two counts and what numbers those will be. And Abe uses those and projects going forward what our current enrollment is as of March and April, and he projects looking at the live birth rate and a lot of different factors that come out his projection for next year. And we'll go through that, but the net effect on the most likely scenario was a 104 student increase. Take that times our foundation allowance, and they'll bring in $870,000 of new revenue just based on the student change for this year. If it was a loss, then you would actually see a negative number in there as a use of funds. So that would actually reduce the amount of money we have for next year. For the enhancement fund, we're going to go into our 5th of 6 years. So we'll be collecting roughly about $7.4 million. And you'll see later on line 28 that you'll actually see a use of enhancement millage. Again, the conversation is we don't plan on this money being used for the day-to-day operations. It may be used to enhance the day-to-day operations, but it doesn't get counted in as part of the budget discussion when we start. So then we could potentially use it to help enhance the budget, but it doesn't start there as we look at next year's program. Because the current year program, if we're using it for operational purposes, goes back to the base and taken back out when we talk about the budget, and we bring it back in as needed for a 1-year allocation. Does that make sense to everybody? Well, that's why you see it coming in and going out, because it still flows through the general fund, but we keep it separate in our budgetary discussions. All right, and next year, we know that our health insurance is capped at the state level of an increase of 2%. And as part of the budgetary discussions, our contracts are settled for next year, and they were all already allocated a health increase not to exceed 5%. So the 2% we know is a fixed cost. Take that 2% times our annual cost right now, and we know it's going to be a $489,000 increase to our healthcare costs for next year. So it's an increase, so that's why you see it as a negative number. All right, the next two line items are the salary increases and the step increases. Right now, all the contracts allow for a 2% increase. That'll be the 3rd year of our 5-year contract. And the first 3 years were all 2%. And years 4 and 5 was based upon the increase or change in our foundation allowance. So that is estimated at 0.7 for the next 2 years. But for this year, going into 2021, we looked at a 2% increase. Now, obviously, if we're just talking budget discussions, that is a done deal because we have contracts in place. So that equivalates to $3.2 million in just the general fund. Obviously, the increase in the foundation allowance goes across all the funds that the funded projects, which include Title I, Title II. It goes into food service, it goes to adult ed, all those different contracts. But we're talking about just the general fund right here. All the other contracts live within their means, or if they don't live with their means, then they have to ask the general fund for an allocation. So for practical purposes of this discussion, we're talking just the general fund. So for example, if Title I had an increase in budget, they would budget that increase. If they had a decrease in budget, they have to look to see where they have to cut in that grant to get the budget back in line. So theoretically, it should not impact the general fund either way. Now, obviously, we do have that broader discussion when we talk about the budget of how to allocate staffing to which budget. But for right now, this is just the general fund portion of people that are in the general fund in this school year. And that does include retirement as part of that increase. In addition to that, our contract has steps. So if you're anywhere between the steps 1 and 18, you're entitled to a step on the next fiscal year. And that happens at different times depending on which union group. But that's roughly going to be 5.8 million. Now that number has grown in the last couple of years. If you remember all the retirements that people are at the top step when they retire, they haven't been getting steps. So the younger generation comes in, they get, they start at whatever step they have, and they're going to get a step increase until they get to the top of the scale. So that number did increase from last year, which is expected as we've had a lot of retirements in the last several years. I know I'm talking a lot, so just give me a shout out if you want me to discuss or go further into detail. The next part of any kind of budget discussion is when you talk about retirements. So if you have a step 18 level teacher leave and you bring someone in at a step 3, 4, or 5, obviously the retiring teacher makes at a higher scale salary than a lower scale teacher. So there is a cost savings between the upper scale and lower scale that you realize in a budget. So in the past, we've had some fluctuations in the counts, but we usually average around 60 for sure in any given year. So that's why we have our most likely a 60 retirements, and that gives us roughly a $3.6 million savings in our budget.
Can I add something to that? Just that we don't know how this current crisis is going to impact that one way or another. It may have an impact on individuals' decisions, whether they're eligible to retire. So,
On average, when a new teacher comes in, what step do they fall at? Do you know? Can you do an average or not?
Well, we look at that. I use a higher than the normal one just for budgeting purposes to be conservative.
Right.
But it'll be time, depending if they're math or science or special ed,
Right.
to fill positions. So they might start a little higher, but a gym teacher will start lower. So there's always the outside demands of what other that position does. Are they a good coach? So you might come in higher if you really need a football coach in that year. A lot of different conversations come into play.
Right. But on average, would you say probably a 6 or 7 or is
I
it
would
just
say
too
lower
hard to
than that.
calculate?
I would say lower than that.
Lower than that? Okay.
now the one, and remember the time outside of this crisis too, we had worked hard in the negotiations to up the starting salary for teachers. So we're at a decent rate too, which was done purposely, but on our end.
Right.
So.
And usually does that include healthcare costs, or that's excluding? Is that realization and cost reduction?
Well, with the DSEHP, they're the ones that handle all that costs and the claims data. So they go out as a group, and we're able to actually combine all the groups. So all the unions and all the personnel in the district have one health plan. That hasn't always been the case. When many times or years ago, the teachers might have a different health plan. The custodians might have a different one. The bus drivers, childcare, they might all have different types of plans. Now, with the way we have the DSCHP, and they understand that being all together, they're able to combine all the population of all of Dearborn and go out for a bid and get a better return because of the claims data across all the groups.
Okay.
So actually, you might have seen a good claims group for teachers, but you might have saw a bad one for custodials. Now that they're kind of averaged out and use it all together, overall, our claim data is good.
And for us, and that's something we've been trying to advertise more when we hire, is that other places they're paying higher into the healthcare, but because of the system that we have in place with the unions controlling and taking the lead and going out and costing it out, we generally save our employees' money. Now that 3.6, Tom, though, million savings would only be based on salary, right? Because generally the healthcare would wash out one employee to another, whether that's a family, right? So
It's just a difference in the salaries plus FICA retirement that's based on your salary level. Healthcare doesn't matter. It stays the same. Because we're going to pay benefits for an FTE for our senior teacher or a new teacher. All levels are the same. All right, the next one is our foundation allowance, and this is just an estimate this time because we really don't have any good data yet. And we're looking at a most likely scenario of a $500 decrease in our foundation allowance. And as you can see, that in itself is causing a big impact on the budget of roughly about a $10 million shortfall just for the foundation allowance by itself. So that's a big number for us that it's going to impact, which is going to drive a lot of our conversations, because that's something that we see coming that we're not going to be able to do much about at the state level, because the state school aid fund makes up more than half of this total state budget. So it's going to impact us considerably in every district in Michigan. And
A couple of questions on that.
yes.
The first one is, over the last several years, when the state will mention how they're increasing our allowance, but then they're taking it back as part of the pension shortfall. Has there been any talk yet about if they're going to require us to keep working on our portion of the pension shortfall? And then the second part is, you mentioned an increase possibly of 104 students, and how that's going to give us 870. Is that using the same base per pupil value then that you're using here with that drop of $500 foundation allowance?
Yes. Yeah, because it's all based upon the estimated allowance of number of students for next year. So it's based on the same dollar value. The actual increase in students, I have to go back and look. It wouldn't be a lot of money, the difference, but it's going to impact it maybe slightly. I have to go and look at that. But when we get to the next screen, I'll be able to tell you one way or the other.
And has the state said anything about the pension shortfall this year, if we're going to need to make the normal contributions, or are they going to give us a little grace?
As of right now, they plan on that. That's one of the budget fixes about they're looking at they can potentially refinance and smooth, which will actually reduce the rate, but it'll push out the payments to a longer time. So it's basically like taking a 30-year mortgage, you're 10 years in.
Yeah.
And say you have 20 years left. So they'll refinance, but make it 30 years.
Right.
So lower rate right away, but you're going to be paying for it longer. So that's one of the things they have talked about.
Okay.
And I won't be here in 30 years to worry about the last 10 years. All right, and then the addendum budget matrix, which is a separate page that carries forward to this page. That's where you're going to see a large number of that is the reduction in the transfer to capital projects that we'll get into. So overall, though, again, we haven't talked about any budget cut at this point. This is really where we're just talking about what we know as assumptions. That we have roughly a $12 million shortfall for this year under our most likely scenario, which would knock our fund balance down to $22 million, which is roughly 9.6% of our operating expenditures. So just to quickly look at the worst case and best case, I won't go through all the assumptions again, but on the worst case, we scroll down. You're looking at an $18 million shortfall. And as a best case, you're looking at roughly about a $6 million shortfall. And that's where you're looking at the foundation decrease might change or go up or down. The number of retirements, it might go up or down. The salary increases, the step increases, obviously the healthcare, those are known costs. And so those aren't going to change unless we actually change, obviously our program. But that doesn't change in these scenarios until we get into starting to talk about budget cuts or adjustments, where we look at, well, there might be a different phase, like phase one. On the best case, we might do these cuts. On a worst case, we'll be doing phase one, phase two, and phase three type cuts. So then that could have a slighter impact of having the worst case scenario have more reductions, or a best case have less, depending on what scenario we're going to choose. And between now and our budget adoption, we'll try to get eventually into where the most likely scenario is what we're going to adopt. All right, so the tab behind this is the adjustments page, the 2019-20 adjustments, where we talk about the cuts in our foundation allowance, and they're color coded. So the yellow is the worst case. Under worst case, we're looking at an $800 student per pupil reduction. Under a best case, $250. And right now we have a most likely at $500. Now, the Headley effect only comes into play if we're actually getting an increase. So it's not going to come into play if it does happen, because we're a hold harmless district. They might have to do additional categorical that used to be called 20J, now is 20M. But obviously, with us getting a reduction, it's not going to come into play this year. But it's on this spreadsheet in case. Looking at student counts. So like you said, you'll see that the spring count is the same for 2020 across the board. We had 20,793 students for our February spring count. They call it spring, even though it happens in February. I can't help you with that. That's what the list But you can see that's 20,793 was bigger than what we had in the fall of last year. If you look at the fall of last year, 20,620. So you can see we actually went up quite a bit to the supplemental count for this current year. And last year we had 20,076. So we usually do go up in the fall or the spring every year. So on the most likely, working at 20,739, which gives us 104.45. Our best case, we're at 50 students more at 20,784. Worst case, we're at 20,604. So it generates different revenues for next year, depending on what it is. And that's why they're color coded, and these just carry forward to the three different scenarios. You see our compensation. So next year, we're looking at $129 million wage level for our salaries we pay in the district. And you'll see the percentage increase is based upon the contract. So you'll see, like the FSC, even though we're only paying 2%, as part of the bargaining in that contract, we added steps on the bus drivers, skilled trades, and things like that. Or we forgave some smaller steps, like on some of our lower level pays. So everybody started $10 or more higher, like on food service, because we couldn't find people at the beginning level because of the economy. So when you add up all those different changes and we win the cost of the contract, their actual contract for this year was roughly 3.06%. So those kind of things that, even though it's 2% in their base wages, there's other things going on in the contract that are cost items that get calculated into this proposal. So that's why you might see a slightly higher rate than what 2% is, just because of those contract changes. Now, you won't see a change between the scenarios since we're all settled between the three different scenarios. If we were in a bargaining year, you might see that, we might hold stronger on a best case scenario than we might hold on a worst case scenario. So those might change, but since they're all settled, they're all the same. Here we talk about the savings. So I use a step 18 and step 3. So you can see what the difference is if you look at what a beginning teacher is and an ending teacher. So you can see we save roughly $41,627 per senior teacher leaving and a beginning teacher beginning. So you can see I start 2 steps higher than a first level teacher. So that gives me a kind of that conservative average that we do hire some staff higher. If you add benefits in, then the FICA retirement, that you're roughly at $60,000, almost $60,800 for every retirement. And that helps offset the steps of when we actually give in any given year.
Question for you on that, Tom.
Yes.
With the last contract, didn't we eliminate the first two steps?
Yes.
So
But
when
I-
you're
but
saying
I-
step three, is that the new step three? Or
No,
the,
that would be, it would be step 5,
okay.
I think. No, maybe not.
Let me check. I can check that too.
I won't look right now, but I'll look at that. But
I'll look.
because I think maybe I didn't move the number, so it's probably still a step 1 then. We have to
Yeah,
look-
I'm just wondering if we're really showing that this is the lowest level, which I don't think we would really be assuming.
right. 'Cause I think
Because you're assuming you're bringing in some experienced teachers as well, which will bring you up.
yes. Yep. So
So
that number will
step,
change slightly.
step 3 is 42,407, but that is the starting from the left from
Okay.
the. That would step 3 is actually like the first step.
I just wasn't
Because
sure
we
if
have
we ever renumbered after that last.
No, I probably
Um,
didn't catch that one.
Yeah, I think because of the way it was in the contract, you kept it based on the contract language. I think that's why it remains. So if you go to the salary schedule, they have it. We'd have to talk to HR, but I believe it was so that they didn't confuse the employees when they started changing it. I believe
Yep,
that's
could
why.
be. Yep.
Then we'd really want to use an assumption, say it's step 5 or 6.
Right. Correct. All right.
But again, when you look at that amount, we moved that up so that we could get our starting teacher up to the, that
Right.
was strategic.
Right.
Yeah, because we had a hard time getting teachers around the 35, 36 range for our beginning teacher. So that's why we did it. Yes. And so to the right, you'll just see this is with FICA retirement. This is a 2.86 with FICA retirement. Small number underneath that. As we, for special ed, we get reimbursed 28% of our money for special ed teachers. And a certain percentage of our teachers that are special ed are moving up on steps. So there's a small savings that's significant enough for us to put on the spreadsheet. So we get some savings back from our funded portion. So the net of these two columns will pull forward to the page. Our next page is our budget matrix. Staffing changes you'll see on the next page, which we'll talk about briefly. Right now, you don't see us having any changes in here really because we haven't started our budget discussions yet in any great detail. The only thing you'll see in here is a little bit about our increase. So right now, you'll look at line 44 here. You can see that we have roughly 3.5 million right now being transferred to our capital project fund, our building and site fund for capital projects. Next year, going down to $1 million. That's why you see a $2.5 million savings that kind of tallies that column H, depending on the scenario that goes forward to each of the stipends. The MIPSers, as you referred to earlier, Jim, is based on our salaries, and the salaries for this year went up 2%. So when they look at MIPSers, cost for reimbursement, that's going to get modified by looking at the current year payroll versus the year before. So we'll see roughly about a $1.2 million increase based upon our MIPSer changes if everything stays the same. Now, unfortunately, they like to play around with these numbers and how they fund MIPSers. So that might be something that we'll have to look at as we get further along the process. We know where the state's going with it. But between the MIPSers of roughly 1.2 and the 2.5 million, that's 3.7 million that we have in savings or additional revenue coming in, offset by our money that we're going to talk about in staffing here in a second of 549,000. Right now, they're all the same because scenario-wise, we haven't got into the conversations of one versus the other. But you'll see that the number down here, 3.17, is what carries forward to all the 3 different scenarios of the most likely, and I'm going to switch over to that. And you can see how it carries forward to this column. So this spreadsheet just basically helps us track some of the changes that we're talking about that's going to carry forward to this budget matrix line item. So looking at the staffing changes, you won't see much here because we haven't done much yet. But one of the things we do know is we know what the retirement rate is. So last year, the retirement rate was 27.5. It's going to go up to 28.21. So that's an increase that we're going to be paying of roughly that 0.71 across all our contracts and all our salaries, I mean. And therefore, we know we're going to incur a $764,000 increase in our retirement costs for next year. That's, based upon the formulas that we're using. Then we also have in the DFSC, DSOEA, ADSA, and DFT contracts that as that rate gets higher, one of the savings we put in the contract back in the 2008, 9, 10 timeframe is they pay 1/3 of that portion increase. And therefore, you'll see that last year they had to pay $987,000 in shared costs for the retirements for last year. Well, for calculation purposes, we give that money back. Now they're going to have to pay $1.2 million this year. So we know that, that what the true dollar value, because we want to know, we don't want to know what the incremental increase is. We know what the total amount is. So we look back at that salary schedule, we know how much to take off. So we know those costs are going to come in. And if you see an X in this column, that means that number is carried forward. So in the yellow scenario, the worst case, have an X, it carries forward to that. The purple is most likely, the green is best case. So if there's an X, it carries forward to that scenario. So what we do here is, I just have one example because we started talking, but we don't usually share this information. We're not going to be filling vacancies unless needed. If you remember, we used to have someone in the capital projects position. That's in my department. And I'll be recommending not to fill that position right now. The primary purpose with that position was if the bond issue was successful, that we were going to have that position there to help coordinate all that. You talk about that dollar value. We don't have the staff to be able to do that. So we were going to have a person on staff to do that. The bond issue not passing, and we're probably not going to go in November, especially after this COVID-19, that those decisions still have to be made by the board. But at this point, I'm recommending not to fill that position. Now, we haven't made a final decision on that yet, but that would be $154,000 savings. And if it does get recommended, then an X gets put in one of the three scenarios, depending on which scenario we're looking at. Or what we could do is take, instead of paying it out of the general fund, we move it to the blue column, which is the enhancement millage, and have the enhancement millage pay for it that 1 year. So this is our kind of our tracking model that we go through to see all the staffing changes as part of the budget process, which is important for me because in a district our size, it's very easy to get lost in the whole shuffle of things and find out that when someone gets hired, we know where to go back to and say where the funding is coming from and what scenario we're under and why we did something or we didn't do something. In a district our size, this is important to kind of keep track of those kind of things. That's where you lose money when you don't track it well.
And Tom, can I just mention too that we started that process of discussions with executive cabinet as far as reductions last week. We have another meeting set up for next week. We have a meeting with the union heads, and so those conversations have started in the groups about potential reductions. And it would be similar, I think, to what we went through a couple of years ago when we had the enrollment cuts and other things. So. And some of the money that didn't come in then with that enrollment and other costs that came into play. And you remember we kind of took a 2-year to make those cuts at that time because we didn't want to impact the classroom. This is a different scenario, but we started a lot of those discussions.
And that's our transparency also with the unions and what we're doing, which is very helpful in our relationships with them.
Now, two factors too that could help, Tom, and I know you're still going through it, but the federal we don't know about that, but if the Fed somehow came in with a stimulus, obviously that would possibly help some of that. Again, there's no prediction there. And then at some point, are you going to talk about the CARES money that we got? And I'll let you when it's appropriate,
Yep.
But that just came in, so.
All right, so now we're going to move toward to a couple of scenarios of looking forward. So again, this is such a big issue. Trying to fix it in 1 year is impossible. I'm going to make this slightly bigger.
Thank you.
All right. So obviously here's our amended budget in this column. And you can see what we have for this year. We have our $67,000 budget right now. Looking at next year, oh, I wonder if that's going to cause. Not quite sure how to get rid of that other stuff. It'll go away in a second. So taking the adjustments we saw in that scenario and putting them in here, you can see where our state aid is going to go up. Eight, or it's going to, you see as a, if you notice, the revenues are negative numbers. If you look at the top, so when you see a negative number, if it's a positive number in the adjustments, that means it's actually a loss of revenue. So just so you're aware of that. So it's the inverse relationship. So we have 169 million in our state aid. The 8.2 million is the net effect of all the adjustments you saw in that previous slide. That our new revenue is going to be 161 million for next year. So that includes the $500 reduction. The CARES program, if you saw the CARES money, that in a separate memo, which I think I put in board briefs, we're going to get roughly about 8.5 million in new money. And then you'll see in the transfers that $2 million is the reduction you're going to see in our transfers to capital projects. So those numbers kind of carry forward in here. So if you look down at some of the assumptions, that obviously the 2.5 million, oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke. The 2 million in orange is what I'm gonna, is in this, I guess, assumptions is that we're gonna use $2 million of our enhancement millage money this year for, 2021 to help settle the budget. So we'll use a one-time allocation out of there to see if we can help itemize, help the general fund portion this year next year, 2021. The green money, which is that 8.5 million we're getting from CARES, I'm rounding it, that if we could use 4.2 million, half of it for our required settlement, for example, if you remember, we have given out many of the Chromebooks to the students of the district. We most likely won't get a lot of those back, and a lot of those were older Chromebooks that we had that depending on how they came back, they might not be in the same state. So we can go out and maybe buy new Chromebooks as part of this CARES Act money and be in compliance with it. In addition, there's going to be supplies that we're going to have to buy that they can reimburse us for supplies we did. So if we use 4.4 million of that and the other 4.4 or 4.2, we kind of move into offsetting our revenue loss. That's what this scenario is trying to do. So then you would look at roughly in the next column here of 5.8 million loss versus the 12 million loss we saw in the other model. So looking at for next year, using some of the enhancement money and using some of the half of the CARES money to help offset the budget. So then we would use fund balance of roughly 5.8 million for next year, so we wouldn't have to make those severe of a cuts. Now, I'm not saying that's where it's going to be, but this is just an example of how we're looking forward at possible scenarios. Then looking in the subsequent, that of the $500 we were losing in our foundation allowance, we would get 250 of that back next year, another 250 back the year after that. So the $500 would be recovered when we get to this school year. So in the 21-22 or 22-23 year, we would actually get our foundation allowance back to where we were this year. That's the assumption I'm making in this model. Now,
But again, it doesn't make up for what's lost.
Right, doesn't make up for what's lost, but at least
it recovers us back to.
And that's what I was watching today's, where they say at the end of calendar year or fiscal year 22, we're going to be back to where we were. So that's kind of why I put that scenario together. Now, obviously, the 2021 year only, the CARES Act is one-time money. And assuming we spend it all and offset our budget, then obviously next year I got to take that money away because it's not going to be there for a second year. So that's why you see the inverse amount being added into that column. Same thing with the additional money we spent on supplies and capital outlay, that money would be gone also. And I also recommended that the last $1 million we had in the transfers site underneath this model would also disappear. So we would actually have no funding for capital projects at the end of 2 years from now. So that was just one scenario. Then obviously also here in 22, before we get to 22, 23, our funding would have ran out for our funding for the enhancement millage. So that would have to get added back in, but at least kicks the can down the road so we can basically have some temporary funding for 2 years. And everything else we spent on enhancement millage would not be in here, so therefore we wouldn't have to do it. Don't have to add it back in or anything. So that was one scenario. But looking at the
Tom, can I add something just about the enhancement millage? My understanding is now that will be on the ballot per the Wayne, there was nothing that we needed to do. We didn't take action, but they have enough to move forward, so it will be on the ballot.
Okay.
And then that would just be a continuation that starts in 2 years, correct?
Correct.
Yes, there would be a small reduction though, because if you recall that they added some of the charter schools,
charter
but
schools as well.
it's still, so there is a reduction, and I can't remember the amount. It may have been about $1 million approximately for us, but we would still be getting, a good portion of it. So.
All right. So look at the bottom here.
Or is that in August?
I'm sorry.
November.
Is that in November or is it in August?
November.
November.
By law, they have to be on a regular November, the enhancement millage for the county. It has to be on one of the regular elections that are every 2 years. And so that's why they're doing it now, even though it runs out in a couple of years, because then it would give them another opportunity, because they're limited as to which elections they can use, unlike bonds and other things.
So just looking at the fund balance as we carry it through the 5.8 million would knock our fund balance down to 28 million, which would be 12.58%. Next year it goes down to using 4.4 million of our fund balance. You get to 24 million in our fund balance, 10.8%. Next year using 1.9 million. Next year after that, 658,000. And then in the 5th year, we'd actually be back and adding money to our fund balance of 115,000, so roughly 9.44% fund balance. So that was just one scenario I ran to look at a long-term impact of how we would get back to a balanced budget.
So should we plan on having to go back to summer borrowing for the next few years?
So looking probably in this year, 22, 23, I have to start looking at it, yes.
Okay.
All depends, that's so many years out, that's something we would have to start looking at it that year to see if it's going to be impacted. All right. I have one other scenario I ran, so we load that one up. Bigger. Oh, wrong way. Sorry. That's probably too big.
No, it's not.
All right, so looking the same thing. Obviously, the revenue loss is not going to change. The CARES money is going to change. But what I did here was I said, well, if we really know we're not going to have any money for capital projects, let's just take all of it away now. I'm sorry, this is the wrong one. This is the money for enhancement fund. Instead of using 2 million, let's say we use 3.5 million of the enhancement funds. And that's kind of what we have that's discretionary that we haven't set this year yet. So let's take all of what we have and put it aside. We looked at roughly about a $2 million cut in staffing costs. So looking at going through and saying, all right, I know there's 150,000 in one position for a director position, but if we went through the district, could we find $2 million worth of savings in salary and benefit costs? Obviously, still using half of the money for the CARES fund, like we talked before, and same thing with the building and site fund as we did before. So the two changes are using a little bit more in enhancement funds and looking at a $2 million cut in this for next school year. So that changes our fund balance changed to a 2.1 million versus a $5 million cut. And that gives our fund balance at 14.32%. I think for the next column, no change, looking at obviously half the money coming back for the foundation allowance, the CARES Act going away. Staffing models will just continue as is using the current models. The money for the CARES Act goes away, and the remaining of the sinking fund or the transfer to capital project goes away. Then we would look at a $761,000 shortfall. And again, you know, so basically what this does is gives you a better scenario going forward that I actually recover quicker by making the cuts sooner, and that our fund balance, I can't get the roll. Our fund balance stays closer to 14%. In actually years 4 and 5, I start adding some money back into our building a site fund of roughly 1.5 million and 2 million. And at the end of 5 years, I'm at 14.05%. And this is basically showing that the sooner you make adjustments, the quicker you're obviously going to get out of an operating deficit, and getting a little more creative with the enhancement funds for using the surplus of the enhancement funds to help us out, and some cuts. You can see it changes where our fund balance goes towards the end of the cycle, and we recover quicker.
And saves you the cost of summer borrowing.
Yes. That's what I was trying to hit, that 14% where I know I'd be out of summer borrowing, and we can actually start adding some money back to our capital projects, which we know we desperately need.
But in this example, besides using the enhancement funds to cover ongoing costs versus maybe one-time costs, you're also talking about staffing change.
Right.
Yeah.
Of a $2 million savings in somewhere in the district. Again, you know, obviously these are all discussions we're going to have, but it's just giving you a different scenario of modifying some things in a given year. It could have an impact down the line where you actually get out of it quicker.
Do you see that $2 million in salary savings? And I know this is going to be hard to predict, but coming from any obligation, if we were to have to continue moving forward the way we are, considering the coronavirus stipulations that are put on us at this point. Do you understand my question?
Yep. If you remember back in 2008, and I wasn't here, but that's something that the federal government saw that coming out of the recession was taking. So if you remember the ARR funds, they came and they implemented, just like they're doing now, federal money into all the states to help recover from the recession quicker. And they were able to take those funds and offset salary costs directly, where they do that now, but back then they did. And that's kind of what got people over the hump to kind of get back to a balanced budget and be able to go forward.
Do you see us being able to directly save in salaries by not being able to use employees that we currently have? Do you understand? Like if we can't open buildings or whatever the case may be, is there a savings there? Or
Well,
maybe not open buildings, that's not it. But I mean, if we have to adjust the way we do business, would there be a savings there in salary that you can anticipate?
Yes, just the overtime alone. If we're not doing field trips, we don't have bus transportation. Obviously, I think the state would still require us to pay our employees, but we wouldn't have to have a $3 million contract with Trinity.
Right.
So we spent $3 million with Trinity because we can't get our own staff. That would go away because that would be a cost we would need to do, and that's $3 million savings right there.
Tom, we have some other things, like, for example, we don't know about athletics. You know,
Right.
That was on my list of questions.
You know, we don't know what's going to happen there. So there's a lot of, or like you get into transportation or the amount of need. So let's just say we have a committee that's going to be studying it, and the state's looking at, well, what if, and I talked to the students earlier, but, you know, we're hearing our associations are hearing of three kind of possible options. One is that in the fall, we're all in school just like we normally are, right? There's one. Another option is a hybrid where maybe students are going to school on certain days, but not all week, and you're doing a lot of it online. And a third scenario is that you may be all online because the pandemic is gotten worse, and there's just no way to do that. So these are the scenarios that are being looked at, and I know the governor has a committee. And so I guess under each of those scenarios, there would be a different cost depending on what's going on. Just think of transportation alone. If you're having, partial students coming each day, and we do have some contracts there too, Tom. So but those are still unknowns.
Right.
So, and I know, Tom, you don't like to base on your budget on unknowns, but those are things that could potentially be kind of a nice, and again, we don't want that happening. We want to be everyone back in school, and but in a reality situation, we all know that it may look different and that's why we appointed that committee to look at it.
And at the same time, wouldn't we incur probably more costs related to COVID, so such as prevention, buying of all of these supplies, and obviously because of you're going to be teaching differently, things are going to be totally different as far as costs incurred. But how much can we quantify as of right now the realization of savings from travel, from say salaries, employees that you would not need in such an environment, or that's obviously for the future too?
I think for the future, because we don't have a plan in place right now. We haven't got a lot of direction yet from the state on are they going to have still the hours and days requirements? Food service, how are we going to provide food service? Are we going to go to the classroom, which means we need less people in the cafeteria? There's a lot of questions until we get kind of a direction that otherwise we just be doing exercising to figure out costs that are irrelevant because the state's going in a different direction. So it's kind of tough at this point. The only thing I can guarantee is the budget we're going to adopt is not going to necessarily reflect the model we're going to have in the fall, because we won't know, because the state won't have the revenue projections until August, maybe September. So we're going to be way behind, and we're going to have an estimate. So I think having more discussions like this down the line is going to be more prevalent as we start narrowing what some of those options are.
And one more question. Given that we're currently in the middle of some contracts, some are 2 years out, 3 years out from expiring, do we have leeway of renegotiating some of these contracts given the current situation?
I'll let you answer that one.
I mean, their contracts, so you would have to ask to look at. You can always do that, but right now we're obligated to honor the contracts. So, those are always conversations you can have with the bargaining groups, though, and see. That's why we want to start early, because really the reality is the majority of your the majority of your budget goes down to the salaries, the people, because we're a people business. So there's a couple of ways of doing it. There's savings. There's like reductions. So like what we did a couple of years ago, and those are kind of things that we're going to look at as well. Or you can negotiate for reductions too, but you can't. It's a negotiation. It wouldn't be anything that we can guarantee, which is why Tom's putting it there. Right. And some of the history too, if we go into this situation, I look at the 2007-8 a little differently than now. Obviously, this is because of the coronavirus situation. We were all coming into January, and we had this best budget that we were seeing, and you saw it in the memo from the governor. We were looking at this huge increase that we had never seen, and all the projections of the economy was pumping. Okay. So then all of a sudden it comes, but in 08 it was different. Because and here's the thing that's a little different too. I'll just say the governor has a different position than the previous governor. And again, I'm not saying anything political. I'm just saying so the governor was looking to add, whereas back in 08-09, when Governor Schneider came in, he also reduced the tax revenue base to the state of Michigan. So what happened when the AAER money came in is that it helped for a year. But then there was actually a tax break that went out. And so therefore we were looking at a $400 and something per child cut because of decisions that were made in the state some for different reasons. I'm not going to get into why it happened, or maybe for economic growth and other things. But we understood then, and I was HR at the time. So from 09 to about actually it was probably about 10 to about 2015 when I became superintendent. Every year we were looking at cuts, and there was a couple of years that one year was like $400 something. The difference now is that I think when we recover, I don't see I would see that I don't see that we're going to be looking at transferring money out of the school aid fund to help the overall state budget. But again, we can't say that for 100%. And part of that is because of the position that the governor has taken now versus what's happened in previous administrations. So I'm saying that as a positive versus what happened before, assuming we get out of the COVID-19. And Tom, you felt that way too, that if we get out of the crisis, that, it shouldn't be as long lasting as that last situation, but
Right.
you don't know. You can't, there's obviously no way to predict that because of what's going on right now with the crisis.
Yeah, there's no models out there that shows something similar to be able to forecast out when it's going to get better, if there's going to be a relapse, all that good stuff.
So when my team is planning for reductions, we'll be planning for what we can do within the contracts, and then we can always explore those options with the union heads and others to see what options might be out there. But that's what we had to do 2 years ago when we did staffing reductions, when we had the student count came down, and then remember the state didn't have a budget. And we had to plan for the unknown. Yeah. And so we made some of those cuts. We were able to do it as well. And I'll just say, in talking and you guys all knew this at the time, is that we tried to do our best. Those are tough decisions, but we did our best so that what happened is we had some reduction in resources, but ultimately when it came down to it, we had very few people that actually lost a job because of individuals that retired or other things that occurred. And again, we don't want to lose our great employees, but the reality is that some just do that. And so, and it creates stress for staff. So some staff, they didn't lose a job, but you might recall they got transferred to other buildings or they got transferred to other positions, and that creates stress. But the positive in that, and the unions understand, is that people still had a job and had benefits, and they were still providing services for students. So that's why our team has already made the decision. As far as hiring freeze, the only area that we are going to possibly, you'll see still coming to the board, is those really high needs special ed areas that we have to provide these services to the students. And so those are going to be the only things that you're going to see coming to you. We've already made those kind of decisions because I think it's the responsible thing to do on both ends. And I think, Tom, you agree too, because we also get on the special ed, we also get reimbursement from the county on those funds as well from most of them. So.
Yeah.
Are there costs associated with renegotiating or opening up a contract?
Not per se, but there's going to be, it's a give and take, right? It just depends on what.
Well, it depends on what, but there's nothing automatically, because I'm trying to remember back, and it may have been on the college side, but I think there were some law changes or something, and if we opened up a contract, there were automatically costs incurred, but I think that was a one-time thing because of changes in the law.
Yeah, if there was something on the books and the contract was already in place, when you expire a contract or reopen it, then those laws come into play.
Okay, that's what it was.
Either incurred some additional costs.
Okay, but generally speaking, that doesn't happen.
Typically.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, because you can do it as a letter of agreement too, so it's not opening the full contract.
Okay.
But I think some of that had to do too, Tom, if I recall back in those years with the healthcare, the hard cap.
It was a hard cap, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm remembering now.
So
the last question I have is, how often or when do you want to meet next? Because obviously every week goes by, things are changing and developing. So I didn't want to assume a date when the next meet with the finance committee. And obviously with our current format, it's not as hard to schedule one. So if you want to propose some next dates with Glenn, in the next day or so, we can get something scheduled. And these models are constantly evolving and updating. All the thing that changes the data on the bottom, and then I know which sequence they're in, and we can keep you updated.
Well, I could hear from the committee, but my normal thought would be probably monthly. I think anything more than that, you're just getting into too many unknowns or not enough. I mean, things are going to be so fluid. That's my thought. Unless something changes that we're sure about or something comes down that we can really take
Well,
a
the
hold
first-
of and discuss.
The first meeting in June is when we normally have our budget presentation for public view. And then, for the subsequent meeting after that for the formal approval. So
Okay.
giving a month would give us the one more meeting before the actual budget presentation.
So if we were talking that, then I mean, the day that I'm just throwing it out there on the calendar would be June 1st if we wanted it a month from now.
I would ask though that if there are changes to the numbers between now and then, Tom, if you could just update the sheets and send them out to us.
Okay. Usually when I send them out, I don't send out the staffing one, the last page,
That's fine.
because, those are discussion points. It's not finalized until the budget actually gets adopted. Those come and go depending on how numbers change. So I don't want to really create a lot of worry out there that it's my job going or not going. So we don't usually put those out there.
Yeah, no problem. Or if you see something that comes through from the state that's, like a new, or from the federal, either one, that's new money that's going to be put forward or new discussions or something that's changing that you have a handle on, something that's actually going to happen.
Okay.
So do we want to say tentatively 5:30 on Monday, June 1st, or what's the pleasure of the chair and the...
I like it off the board meeting date because we can take a little more time if we need it than actually trying to rush and get it done before a board meeting.
I'm good with that. Team, are you good with that?
That's good for me.
That's fine.
5:30 is
so
a good time for everyone?
So I'll ask Jacob, I think he's listening, or Eric, one of them will send the invitation because they have to, because of assuming that we're still virtual. We'll just make that assumption until something changes, that we're still virtual. So we'll have them send a note. Great.
We still
I appreciate that. I like scheduling it before so then we all know. So that makes it good. Thank you.
We still have no one signed up for citizens participation.
Okay. Okay.
Tom,
All right.
did you?
We
Did
have
you
one
have
more
some
thing, Glenn. Yep, one more thing. The legal fees.
Yep.
If you saw in board briefs, we had a request by Buyer Howitt to increase their fees from $140 to $150. That's roughly just under like $3,900 total cost if it was analyzed for a whole year. So we're not talking a lot of money in that sense. And I put in there that one of the other legal teams are anywhere from 180 to 220 to 250, 260. So they're well below market. I'm comfortable with it because I know they're our primary for a lot of HR issues and for contractual issues. And even back in 2008, when we had that crisis, they actually took a pay cut back then too. It's only been 2 years that we actually reverted them back up to the original 140.
They served us well over the years too.
Yes, but I thought I'd bring it here first as a finance committee to make sure if there's any concerns, and then it'll actually go to the board next week for formal approval.
Well, and Tom, that would just go in wouldn't that just go as part of the budget, the overall budget approval?
No, it's an actual contract, so it has to go.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay.
But in the times like these, when we're looking to reduce costs, I'm not really comfortable with raising this this cost. You said it's a $10 difference in hourly rate, obviously, right?
Right. And if you look at their average hours they've done over the last several years, $3,800 increase.
How much was that? I'm sorry.
3,800.
Okay.
That's my dog, if you hear it.
Oh.
Is the
I
dog
see you.
saying it's time for us to end?
Pretty much.
I see too, Roxanne. You're letting us really see the amazing blue M in the
Oh, I am.
background.
So the next meeting is again June
June 1st.
June 1st. Okay. Sounds good.
All right.
Right.
Questions?
Thank you, Tom. That was a very good presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. And if I can add, if we can get an update after the 15th
Yes.
from that important meeting. So
Yeah.
I guess
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be a lot of dialogue after. It usually takes a day to get things processed, to validate the numbers. But usually by, 2 to 3 days afterwards, there's a position that come out by the House Fiscal or Senate Fiscal agencies, and they'll tell us what the numbers are looking like.
And this is even a greater time to engage our legislatures to tell them that we were in the hole before this crisis. And although we were anticipating cuts, but we should not be taking greater cuts either. So it's
our teachers are now just getting back to where they were back in 2008-9 when they took that 6% cut. They're now just getting back to a little slightly above where they were, 10, 12 years ago. That's
And
why
I have brought this up to our legislators before a few weeks ago, knowing that this was coming. But we have to realize that everyone in the state's going to be feeling this.
Yeah.
We're
Yes.
not being singled out.
And while everybody's going to realize those unfortunate deep cuts, they will unfortunately have to be across the board, as I foresee it from your presentation, Tom. So we'll have to look into creative ways of even reducing, obviously salary costs. That's our biggest item, and hopefully not cut positions and lay off people. That would be kind of the right thing, I think, especially during these times when people are in very, very desperate situations.
And I'll send out the presentation they did today. It'll probably be tomorrow. And you can look at some of the graphs and show their assumptions of, actually, they said if people start opening the society by the end of May, and June, you'll see that the recovery is, and you can see some of those graphs to see that such decline, but hopefully we'll get back to where we need to be for the economy.
If I can add too, based on what Trustee Moses said too, then that is kind of like when we kind of went through, again, on a more minor level, that it creates discomfort for both parents and sometimes students and staff when you have to change positions or move people around. But it does help the overall budget. And secondly, you're still maintaining jobs for people. So that person that had to move to another position, they're still getting the benefits in their salary. If we put it into perspective so that everyone understands that that's likely the scenario we're going into again, like we did last time. So again, it's a little bit disruptive, but we'll try to do it in a way like what you just said so that we don't have, layoffs is what we try to prevent.
And I would like to start leading by example, and I would propose a reduction. It's very symbolic, but a reduction to look into the travel costs. Obviously, that's going to save from the board travel and travel. But
chances are we won't be going to any conventions anytime soon.
Yeah.
So
realization of savings, but also even the stipend that board members individually get, I would look into reducing those as well, so we can share the sacrifice, obviously, of everybody is gonna.
Sure.
Well, I would also like to just address that in one thing. None of us does it for the money, and it's not a large stipend. But when the 6% across the board cuts were taken, the board took that too, and the board never recovered that funds. So, I mean, it's not a lot, but that money has helped me pay my mortgage before when my husband's been laid off. So I'm just throwing that out there too.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
but I understand symbolically.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
And we'll look at credit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we are adjourned. Is everybody in agreement?
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes.
Okay, we are ending at 7:02. Have a good evening, everyone.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.